A cat's intuition, a heartwarming tale of devotion and fate. Night descended gently over the quiet corridors of St. Augustine Hospital, where fluorescent lights flickered, casting a sterile, pale glow against the pristine white walls. The rhythmic beeping of monitors, the occasional murmur of hushed voices, and the soft footfalls of nurses created a subdued melody of life and duty. At the farthest end of one such corridor, behind a solitary door, lay an elderly man named Andrew. His body, frail and exhausted, clung to life with the aid of machines and IV drips. His breaths were shallow, his once vibrant spirit now dwindling in the face of an inevitable farewell. Doctors had already prepared his family for the worst, delivering the dreaded news that it was only a matter of time before Andrew would slip away. The atmosphere around his ward felt heavy, thick with sorrow, like the oppressive stillness before a storm. But while family and medical staff resigned themselves to fate, there was one companion in Andrew's life who had never accepted separation, his cat. Miko. For years, Miko had been Andrew's unwavering shadow, a sleek, intelligent feline with golden eyes that held an uncanny depth. Miko had shared in every part of Andrew's life, whether it was curling up on his lap during long winter nights, perching on the windowsill as Andrew read his morning paper, or offering silent comfort during the hardest of times. Miko was always there. However, hospital regulations strictly forbade pets. So for weeks, while Andrew's condition deteriorated, Miko had been left at home, unaware of his owner's critical state. That changed on a somber evening when Andrew's son, Devon, received a call that sent ice through his veins. The end was near. Panic gripped his chest as he rushed to the hospital. But amidst his turmoil, one thought struck him with desperate clarity: Miko needed to say goodbye. Without a second thought, Devon made a decision that defied rules and expectations. He wasn't going to let Andrew leave this world without the comfort of his beloved cat. Ignoring the wary glances of the hospital staff, Devon carefully concealed Miko in his coat, his heart pounding as he maneuvered through the maze of hallways. Miko, typically an observant and quiet creature, remained unusually still, as if he sensed the gravity of the moment. When they reached Andrew's room, Devon hesitated for only a brief second before pushing open the door. The sight before him stole his breath. Andrew lay motionless, his face pale, his frail chest rising and falling in agonizingly slow intervals. The beeping of the machines filled the room with an eerie rhythm, a countdown that no one could stop. As Devon stepped inside, Miko stirred, his ears twitching. Then, the cat leaped gracefully from Devon's arms onto the bed, his tiny paws making no sound as he approached Andrew's still hand. A low, mournful trill escaped Miko's throat, a sound so filled with sorrow that Devon felt tears sting his eyes. The cat nuzzled Andrew's fingers, rubbing his cheek against them, his golden eyes searching for recognition. At first, nothing changed. The room remained a solemn chamber of inevitability. Then, something unexpected happened. Miko's sleek body tensed, his ears flicked back, his tail stiffening as he turned sharply toward the door. A deep, rumbling growl, so uncharacteristic of the gentle feline, vibrated through his small frame. Devon, startled, followed his gaze just as the door swung open, revealing Dr. Patel, the physician overseeing Andrew's palliative care. The doctor, taken aback by the sight of a cat in the hospital room, hesitated in the doorway, but Miko's reaction was strange. His fur bristled, his golden eyes locked onto Dr. Patel's medical bag with an almost predatory intensity. "Miko, what's wrong?" Devon murmured, reaching out to soothe the cat. But Miko wouldn't budge. He let out another low, guttural growl, stepping between Andrew and the doctor. Dr. Patel frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "I need to administer Andrew's morphine. It will help ease his pain," he explained, lifting the bag onto the bedside table. Miko's reaction intensified. He hissed, his back arching, his body coiled like a spring ready to strike. The unexpected aggression sent a ripple of unease through the room. Andrew's nurse, a kind-faced woman named Talia, exchanged a glance with Devon, her brows furrowed in concern as she hesitated, then spoke with quiet uncertainty. "Doctor, maybe we should double-check the medication." Dr. Patel sighed, clearly frustrated. "We do this every day. I assure you, everything is in order." But Miko did not back down. His golden eyes flicked from the doctor to the bag, his tail lashing in agitation. There was something deeply wrong, something only he could sense. Talia hesitated only a second longer before making a decision. She reached for the bag and carefully sifted through its contents. Her fingers froze when she found the small vial tucked inside. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. This isn't the right dosage," she whispered, her face draining of color. "It's labeled 100 milligrams. But Andrew's prescription is for 10 milligrams." A stunned silence fell over the room. Devon's blood turned to ice. If that morphine had been administered, Andrew would have received a lethal overdose. Dr. Patel, now visibly shaken, snatched the vial and examined it with trembling hands. His expression shifted from confusion to horror as realization dawned. Somewhere along the way, whether by accident or negligence, Andrew's medication had been dangerously mislabeled. If not for Miko's reaction, no one would have caught the error in time. "Oh, my God," Talia breathed, pressing a hand to her chest. "He would have." She couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of what nearly happened settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Dr. Patel swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how this happened. We'll launch an immediate investigation." His fingers trembled as he placed the vial aside. He looked at Miko, still poised protectively over Andrew. "Your cat just saved his life." Devon, heart pounding, reached for Miko, stroking the soft fur along his back. The cat, sensing the tension had eased, let out a slow, rumbling purr, his body relaxing. He turned back to Andrew, brushing his whiskers against the man's cheek, as if reassuring him that he was safe. Then, for the first time in days, Andrew stirred. A faint, raspy moan escaped his lips. Devon's head snapped toward his father, disbelief crashing over him as Andrew's eyelids fluttered weakly. His fingers twitched, and though his voice was barely above a whisper, he managed to rasp out two fragile words. "Miko, saved." Tears welled in Devon's eyes. Talia, still overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment, wiped her own damp cheeks. "It's like he knew," she murmured in awe. "Somehow, he just knew." Word of Miko's miraculous intervention spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses and doctors whispered in stunned voices about the cat who had defied the odds, who had somehow sensed danger before trained medical professionals could. Even the hospital administration, despite its strict no-pet policy, made an exception. For the rest of Andrew's days, Miko was allowed to stay by his side, curled up on his bed, offering the quiet companionship he always had. Though Andrew remained frail, his passing was no longer a rushed inevitability. Instead, he was granted more time, precious days filled with the comforting presence of his beloved cat. And as the morning sun spilled through the hospital blinds, casting soft golden stripes onto Andrew's bed, Miko stretched, yawned, and settled once more against his owner's side. His job wasn't done just yet. A cat's intuition, a story of unwavering devotion and a fate rewritten. The story of Miko, the feline guardian who had saved Andrew's life, quickly spread beyond the hospital's walls. What had begun as a private, deeply personal moment was now capturing the hearts of people far and wide. The hospital staff spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. Patients whispered the tale among themselves. And before long, the local press caught wind of the extraordinary event. A journalist arrived at the hospital, eager to document the miraculous intervention. Sitting in the dimly lit room, he watched in quiet fascination as Miko curled up beside Andrew, resting his head on the frail man's lap with the quiet confidence of a protector who had no intention of leaving his post. The reporter raised his camera and, with a soft click, captured an image of pure, unshakable devotion. Andrew, weakened but at peace, his fingers barely brushing Miko's fur, and the cat, steadfast in his silent vigil. When the article was published, the response was overwhelming. People were captivated by the idea of a cat, so often perceived as independent and aloof, displaying such fierce loyalty and intelligence. Donations flooded in to help cover Andrew's mounting medical bills. Messages of support poured into the hospital, and strangers who had never met Andrew felt connected to his story in an inexplicable way. Devon, though immensely grateful for the outpouring of kindness, felt a deep unease about the private moment becoming a public spectacle. But Andrew, ever humble, simply offered a weak smile and murmured, "If Miko's story brings hope to others, then let it be." A few days later, a soft knock echoed at the door of Andrew's hospital room. Devon looked up to find an older woman standing hesitantly in the doorway. Her frail fingers curled around the leash of a small, trembling dog. Her eyes, rimmed with red, shimmered with unshed tears as she took in the sight before her. I lost my husband last week," she whispered, her voice unsteady, "and I heard about what your cat did for you." She hesitated, glancing down at her dog. "I just keep thinking, maybe if my husband had been allowed to have his dog by his side. Maybe he wouldn't have been so alone at the end." Her gaze drifted to Miko, who lifted his head and studied her with quiet curiosity. Despite the difference in species, there was something about the cat's stillness, his unwavering presence, that seemed to comfort her. Andrew, too weak to offer more than a gentle nod, held her gaze with an understanding that words could not convey. The woman lingered for a moment, absorbing the silent connection, then wiped at her tears with trembling fingers. Talia, who had been standing just outside, stepped forward and gently guided the grieving woman away, whispering soothing words of comfort. But the encounter left a lasting imprint in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement of how deeply intertwined love and loss could be. That evening, just as the hospital settled into its usual nighttime rhythm, the stillness in Andrew's room shattered. A sudden, violent convulsion racked his frail body, his breath catching in a strangled gasp. The machines monitoring his vitals erupted into a symphony of alarms, their shrill beeps slicing through the air like sirens of impending disaster. Devon bolted upright, his chair screeching against the floor as panic seized his chest. "Dad," his voice cracked with terror as he lunged toward the bed. Miko, who had been curled against Andrew's side, sprang into action, his sleek body pressed against his owner's trembling frame, his ears flattening as if to shield him from unseen agony. A deep, distressed meow tore from his throat, a sound so raw, so filled with desperation, that it sent shivers down Devon's spine. Doctors and nurses stormed into the room, their movements swift and precise. Dr. Patel, his expression grim, barked orders as they scrambled to stabilize Andrew. The tension was suffocating, thick with the unspoken fear that this might be the final battle. But then, against all odds, the storm passed. By the time morning arrived, Andrew had emerged from the crisis, not unscathed, but alive. Talia, still shaken, ran a trembling hand through her hair as she glanced at Miko, who had remained beside Andrew the entire time. "He just won't quit, will he?" she murmured, her voice laced with awe. She reached down to stroke the cat's head, offering a silent thanks. Devon, his body still humming with residual fear, slumped into a chair, his breath unsteady. Miko padded over and nudged his hand, his whiskers brushing against Devon's fingers in a small, comforting gesture. Andrew, his eyes half-lidded from exhaustion, exhaled softly, his voice, barely a whisper, carried the faintest trace of relief. The days stretched into an unpredictable rhythm, moments of peace shattered by sudden dips in Andrew's condition, only for him to stabilize once more. The hospital staff, half in jest and half in wonder, began referring to Miko as Andrew's personal nurse. Always alert, always watchful. Even Dr. Patel, still haunted by his near-fatal mistake, had developed a quiet reverence for the feline who had prevented a tragedy. And then, a few days after Miko had stopped the lethal dose, a new revelation sent another shockwave through the hospital. Talia, while restocking supplies, noticed something odd in the pharmacy's storage room: a box of medication vials, unsealed and with mismatched labels. A cold dread curled in her stomach as she examined them. The mislabeling was eerily similar to the error that had nearly cost Andrew his life. A ripple of unease spread through the staff. Was it negligence, or something more sinister? Talia immediately reported her discovery to her supervisor, who launched an internal investigation. The whispers among the nurses turned from awe to worry. If someone had been tampering with medications, had Andrew been targeted, or had it simply been a stroke of luck that Miko had intervened before tragedy struck? Meanwhile, within the quiet confines of Andrew's hospital room, time pressed forward. Devon, unwilling to leave his father's side, spent most nights dozing in the recliner. Miko, unwavering as ever, remained curled at Andrew's feet, only leaving briefly to stretch or eat before resuming his post. Then, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, another figure from Andrew's past walked through the door. Kayla, Andrew's estranged daughter, stood frozen at the threshold, guilt and regret etched into her features. She had been absent for years, lost in old family tensions. But the news of her father's declining health had finally pulled her home. Her gaze landed on Miko, the cat she had heard so much about, and a lump formed in her throat. He's been taking care of you better than I ever did, she whispered, her voice thick with sorrow. Miko studied her for a long moment before stepping forward, sniffing at her outstretched hand. Then, in an uncharacteristic display of acceptance, he allowed her to stroke his fur. A single tear slipped down Kayla's cheek as she turned to her father, her fingers trembling as she reached for his hand. Andrew's lips curled into a weak smile, his fingers twitching ever so slightly in response. It was enough. But the night was not over. Later that evening, Talia returned with an update, one that made Devon's blood run cold. The hospital's investigation had uncovered multiple instances of mislabeled medication vials. What had happened to Andrew was not an isolated incident. Someone, either through reckless negligence or something far worse, had been tampering with the pharmacy's supplies. A chilling possibility loomed in the air. Had Andrew's near overdose been an accident? Or had someone wanted him, and others like him, to slip away unnoticed? Fury and fear churned in Devon's chest. His father, though terminally ill, deserved dignity in his final days. If there was someone in the hospital deliberately endangering patients, they needed to be stopped. And as Miko curled protectively against Andrew's side, his golden eyes glinting in the dim hospital light, one thing became clear: the cat had sensed danger long before any human had. And perhaps he wasn't done protecting his owner just yet. The Silent Guardian, a story of love, redemption, and an unseen threat. As the days passed, Andrew remained suspended in a delicate balance between life and the inevitable. His health wavered unpredictably, one moment. His breath was steady, his awareness sharp, the next. He drifted into an exhausted haze. But through it all, Miko never left his side. The cat had become more than a companion, he was a silent protector. A steadfast sentinel standing guard against the unseen forces that lurked beyond the hospital room. It was during one of Andrew's more lucid moments that an unexpected visitor arrived. Kayla stood hesitantly in the doorway, her hands twisting together as she took in the fragile man before her. It had been years since she'd seen him, years filled with missed calls, unspoken apologies, and a growing wall of regret that had seemed impossible to climb. Now, faced with the reality of her father's condition, that wall crumbled in an instant. Tears welled in her eyes as she stepped closer. "Dad, it's me." Andrew's eyelids fluttered open at the sound of her voice. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, as if his mind was struggling to bridge the gap between the past and the present. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke her name. That was all it took. Kayla broke down, recounting every regret, every moment she had let slip through her fingers. She spoke of the lost years, the silence that had stretched too long, the fights that now seemed so meaningless. Devon stood quietly to the side, arms crossed, his own emotions a tangled mess. But it was Miko who moved first. The cat, having watched the exchange with an uncanny understanding, pressed close to Andrew's side, his golden eyes shifting between father and daughter as if absorbing every word, every unsaid emotion. Then, with the last bit of strength he could muster, Andrew reached out, his trembling fingers closing over Kayla's hand. His voice was weak, but the words were clear. "I love you both." The weight of those words shattered every barrier. Old resentments melted away, replaced by something fragile yet profoundly real, a second chance. No matter how fleeting. Kayla, still trembling, reached down to stroke Miko's soft fur, her fingers brushing lightly against his ears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "for watching over him." But as the emotional wounds began to heal, a darker question remained unanswered. If someone had been tampering with medications, if there was a deliberate act of sabotage unfolding within the hospital, who was behind it? And why? Talia, ever perceptive, knew they needed more than just suspicions. She discreetly warned Dr. Patel to keep a closer eye on medication orders, to watch for anything unusual, staff acting strangely, vials disappearing, records that didn't quite add up. The rumor mill had already begun churning. Whispers floating through the hospital corridors about a certain pharmacy technician who had long expressed resentment toward the hospital's policies. "He always complains about wasting resources on terminal patients," one nurse murmured in passing. "Says we should be focusing on people who actually have a chance." A chilling thought took root. Could someone truly believe they were doing the right thing by hastening the deaths of those they deemed beyond saving? No one dared to confront the technician directly. He had worked at the hospital for years, a well-known figure with tenure and influence. Without concrete proof, accusations could do more harm than good. But Talia couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at her every time she saw him near the supply rooms. Miko, too, seemed to sense something, though oblivious to human politics. The cat reacted differently whenever the technician passed by Andrew's door. Normally calm and collected, Miko would let out a low growl, his tail flicking in irritation. His gaze locked onto the man's retreating figure. Kayla, determined to make up for lost time, joined Devon in keeping watch. She slept in the hospital lounge some nights, forging a fragile alliance with her brother as they took turns stepping into the hallway, scanning for any unfamiliar faces near their father's room. Meanwhile, Talia continued her quiet investigation. Every new vial of medication was checked and double-checked. She scanned barcodes, cross-referenced prescriptions, and made sure that nothing suspicious made its way into Andrew's IV. It felt like a covert operation, a secret war waged in whispers and careful glances. But all it would take was one mistake, one moment of oversight, for the saboteur, if there was one, to strike again. Andrew's condition remained unpredictable. Some days, he was alert, his tired eyes filled with warmth as he gazed at Miko, managing a few whispered words of gratitude. Other days, he seemed distant, lost in a fog of exhaustion. And yet, the one constant was the cat who never left his side. At first, the hospital staff had been skeptical about allowing an animal in the ICU. But over time, Miko had won him over. Nurses began stopping by not just to check on Andrew, but to marvel at the feline's unwavering devotion. They whispered among themselves, speaking of how Miko's presence brought a strange, intangible comfort, not just to Andrew, but to everyone who crossed his path. Then, the first major revelation shattered any illusions of mere coincidence. Talia had been right to be suspicious. Her discovery of the unsealed vials had set off a chain reaction within the hospital's administration. An internal review was launched, and more discrepancies were found, medications mislabeled, records altered. The uncomfortable truth became undeniable. Miko hadn't just saved Andrew's life by accident. He had stopped something far more sinister. If not for his intervention, Andrew would have been just another statistic, another case file buried beneath bureaucratic oversight. And that realization changed everything. Kayla, Devon, Talia, and Dr. Patel knew they could no longer afford to simply observe. They vowed, in whispered discussions and silent agreements, to protect Andrew at all costs. Because somewhere in the hospital, someone was playing God. The following morning, tension hummed in the air like an unstruck chord. Devon sat by the window, scrolling through job listings on his phone but barely seeing the words. Kayla sat beside Andrew, reading aloud from a worn scrapbook filled with old family memories. And at the foot of the bed, Miko dozed lightly, lifting his head every time someone unfamiliar passed by the open door. Dr. Patel arrived with Talia, carrying Andrew's next dose of medication. They had meticulously verified its origin, leaving nothing to chance. The hospital administration had even installed extra cameras near the pharmacy, their presence a silent testament to the growing unease that was fracturing the once tight-knit medical team. Rumors spread like wildfire, staff exchanged wary glances. The usual camaraderie had eroded into suspicion. Who among them was capable of such a thing? Who had taken it upon themselves to decide who lived and who didn't? Andrew, caught in the storm of uncertainty, remained largely unaware of the brewing chaos. When Devon and Kayla tried to explain, his only response was a faint nod. His eyes clouded with exhaustion, but every now and then, a flicker of fear passed across his face. He had accepted that his time was limited, but he had wanted to go on his own terms, not hurried along by someone else's cruel intent. Miko, sensing his unease, pressed his small body against Andrew's arm, his deep purring filling the quiet space like a heartbeat of reassurance. Outside the room, Talia wrestled with a moral dilemma. She wanted to involve the police immediately, but the hospital insisted on handling things internally first. We don't want to cause unnecessary panic, her supervisor argued. Talia's jaw clenched. If patients are in danger, then panic might be exactly what we need. But hospital politics moved slowly, even in the face of potential tragedy. And in the shadows of that slow-moving bureaucracy, a predator still lurked. Devon and Kayla had no choice but to keep watch. Talia and Dr. Patel had no choice but to wait for evidence. And Miko, ever vigilant, remained the one unshakable force between Andrew and the unseen threat that lingered just beyond the door. But fate wasn't done with him yet. The final battle had yet to come. The Silent Guardian, a story of redemption, hidden dangers, and unwavering devotion. In the days following her return, Kayla immersed herself in her father's care, making up for lost time in any way she could. Though she could never regain the years spent apart, she was determined to be present now, to help however possible. She ran small errands, picking up fresh clothes for Devon, ensuring Andrew had his favorite peppermint candies to soothe his dry throat, and even taking it upon herself to order Miko's special cat food. At first, Miko had been wary of her presence. The feline, ever discerning, had spent so much time guarding Andrew that any new presence was met with quiet scrutiny. But Kayla was patient. She allowed Miko to observe her, to test her sincerity in small, subtle ways. Then, one evening, as she reached out tentatively, Miko finally accepted her, pressing his head into her palm as she gently scratched behind his ears. It was the smallest gesture, yet it felt monumental, a silent acknowledgement that she was now part of the inner circle. But beyond the warm moments shared inside Andrew's hospital room, an undercurrent of unease continued to flow beneath the surface. One late afternoon, as Talia made her usual rounds, she overheard a heated argument near the pharmacy. A man's voice, sharp with bitterness, snapped. "It's not my fault these meds were mislabeled." Another voice, hushed but insistent, pressed for explanations. Talia's pulse quickened as she edged closer, peering carefully around the corner. There, she spotted the very technician who had unsettled her before. His eyes burned with something unspoken, resentment, frustration, perhaps even something more dangerous. Though she couldn't catch every word, certain phrases sent a chill through her. Terminal patients, wasted resources. A cold dread settled in her chest. This could be the person responsible, the one who had nearly taken Andrew's life. But without proof, what could she do? Swallowing her frustration, she backed away before the technician noticed her. Later that evening, she gathered Devon and Kayla in a quiet corner of the hospital lounge and confided her suspicions. "There's one specific technician who's always vocal about his disdain for end-of-life care," she murmured, glancing around to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "He thinks we're wasting hospital resources on people who are already dying. I just overheard him arguing about mislabeled medication." Kayla's expression darkened, her fingers curling into fists. "If he's tampering with my dad's meds, he's playing with his life." Devon's jaw clenched, his voice taut with suppressed fury. "We can't let that psycho anywhere near him." Miko, sensing the tension, let out a low, warning growl from his place on Andrew's bed. Together, they formed an impromptu plan, subtle, careful, but necessary. They would watch the technician discreetly, ensuring that every single vial of Andrew's medication bypassed the usual supply chain until the threat was neutralized. Yet, amid the swirl of suspicion and silent battles waged behind hospital walls, something else was happening, something unexpected. Kayla and Devon, once so estranged, found themselves talking. At first, it was strained, filled with hesitant words and cautious glances. But over time, the distance between them lessened. Sitting in the cafeteria late one night, they spoke of childhood memories, of the things Andrew had done to try and keep the family together. They even joked, something they hadn't done in years, comparing Miko to a four-legged detective. A tiny yet powerful force uncovering secrets no human could. And Andrew, though his voice remained weak and frail, managed to speak just enough to urge them forward. "No more regrets," he whispered, his trembling hand squeezing Kayla's. A lump formed in her throat as she kissed his forehead, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. Devon, standing at the foot of the bed, swallowed hard, his own emotions barely held at bay. They had waited too long to come together. But now, they were united in a vow, one unbreakable promise to protect their father from whatever threats still lurked in the shadows. The hospital staff took quiet notice of the shift. Where there had once been only grief, there was now a fierce determination. Where there had once been only impending loss, there was now the smallest, most fragile glimmer of hope. Yet trouble was far from over. The pharmacy technician had begun noticing Talia's watchful gaze. He had grown more guarded, his eyes narrowing whenever he passed her in the hallway, though he kept his comments subtle around superiors. There were murmurs, snide remarks under his breath about people playing God, about how certain patients should be allowed to go peacefully. Talia's instincts screamed at her that Andrew remained in danger. We can't leave his medication unguarded for even a second, she warned. And so, the quiet war continued. Andrew's energy fluctuated wildly. One day, he could hold a brief conversation. The next, he barely had the strength to open his eyes. But through it all, Miko never wavered. When Andrew whispered, "Good boy, my hero," Miko pressed closer, his purring a steady, soothing presence. Nurses, watching from the doorway, wiped away tears. They all felt it, the quiet ticking clock. Not just of Andrew's terminal condition, but of something darker. A second sabotage attempt seemed inevitable. Behind closed doors, Talia fought to expose the truth. But some hospital administrators resisted. "We can't start throwing accusations without hard evidence," they insisted. It would create a scandal. Dr. Patel, haunted by his near-fatal mistake, stood by Talia's side, pushing for stronger security measures in the pharmacy. Meanwhile, Kayla and Devon pored over hospital records, searching for patterns, anything that could expose the technician's wrongdoing. An unusual coalition had formed. A nurse, a doctor, two siblings who had spent years apart, and one extraordinary cat. Amid the quiet battle, something else shifted. Kayla and Talia formed an unlikely friendship, bonding over late-night coffee in the staff lounge. Talia spoke of her childhood dog, how it had once saved her father's life by detecting a gas leak. "Animals sense danger," she mused, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. Kayla nodded, thinking of Miko's unwavering vigilance. But while they fought to protect Andrew from human threats, another reality loomed: his growing medical expenses. Months of hospitalization had drained resources. Devon, struggling under the weight of it, considered launching a fundraiser. Kayla offered to help, dipping into her savings. Andrew, ever selfless, whispered, "No trouble for me," but they all knew the truth. If his care was cut short, his fragile survival would be at even greater risk. Meanwhile, Dr. Patel's internal review uncovered something disturbing. Certain medication vials had gone missing on days when terminal patients had died unexpectedly. If the technician was behind this, did he truly believe he was offering mercy? Or was it something far more sinister? The implications sent a fresh wave of cold determination through them all. Then, disaster struck again. One morning, Andrew awoke gasping, his chest heaving as alarms blared. Talia rushed in, adjusting the oxygen flow. Miko, alarmed, leaped onto the bed, pressing his small body against Andrew's, as if trying to keep him anchored to life. Kayla clutched her father's hand, her voice shaking. "Stay with us, Dad." Dr. Patel, working quickly, administered medication, only after Talia verified the label. Slowly, Andrew's tremors eased. Outside, whispers spread through the hospital. The media had caught wind of Andrew's story once more. A small crowd gathered near the lobby, leaving notes, flowers, and stuffed animals. Kayla and Devon, though touched, felt overwhelmed. Meanwhile, hospital PR staff worked quickly, crafting a narrative about patient-centered care, skirting any mention of sabotage. Talia gritted her teeth at the hypocrisy. And through it all, Miko remained the one constant. Even as the hospital walls hid secrets, even as threats loomed, the cat never left Andrew's side. He would not fail him now. The silent guardian, a battle between compassion and cruelty. Even those who had never particularly liked animals found themselves drawn to Miko's steady, watchful presence. There was something almost hypnotic about the way he remained at Andrew's side. A constant force of reassurance in an ever-changing tide of uncertainty. When Andrew grew restless at night, shifting uncomfortably in bed as sleep evaded him, Miko instinctively responded. With quiet grace, the feline would leap onto a nearby chair, positioning himself just within reach. Andrew's frail fingers, trembling yet determined, would stroke Miko's soft fur. And almost instantly, a change would settle over him. His breathing would slow, the tension in his body easing. It was a comfort deeper than any medication, a soothing presence that even modern medicine couldn't replicate. The nurses took note of it, whispering among themselves as they updated charts. They couldn't explain it, but on the nights Miko stayed close, Andrew's blood pressure stabilized, his heart rate more even. Some dismissed it as mere coincidence, but for those who witnessed it firsthand, it was nothing short of miraculous. Yet, as moments of peace flickered in and out of existence, the shadow of an unseen threat continued to loom. In a deeply unsettling twist, The very pharmacy technician Talia had suspected, the man who had voiced his disdain for terminal patients, began making a show of concern. With an almost eerie politeness, he started bringing small candies for the ward staff, flashing forced smiles and murmuring words of sympathy. Talia accepted them with careful neutrality, her skin crawling. She had seen enough in her years as a nurse to recognize manipulation when it was happening. There was something almost predatory in the way the technician carried himself now. As if he was testing the waters, gauging how close he could get before anyone grew suspicious again. She worried he was waiting for them to relax, to let their guard down. Her fears deepened when Kayla, passing by one afternoon, overheard him speaking to a colleague, wasting resources on hopeless cases. Kayla's hands clenched into fists, her breath hitching in barely contained fury. Devon had to talk her down later that evening, reminding her that a public confrontation wouldn't bring them the proof they needed. Meanwhile, Andrew clung to life, suspended in a fragile limbo between fleeting recoveries and near misses. The tension in the ward was palpable, growing tighter each day. Everyone could feel it, that lurking sense that the saboteur was waiting for another opportunity. Maybe not for Andrew this time, but for someone else. Dr. Patel, seeing no other choice, quietly arranged for security cameras to be installed near the supply cabinets. The hospital administration, spooked by the looming threat of lawsuits, finally approved an official audit, but they were dealing with someone clever. The technician had already proven himself to be cautious, careful. If he felt cornered, he might become even more dangerous. Through all of this, Andrew's will to survive burned valiantly, even as his body weakened. Miko remained his ever-vigilant guardian, silently assessing each person who entered the room. If an unfamiliar scent lingered on their clothing, his tail would flick, his ears twitching with quiet suspicion. But whenever Talia or Dr. Patel arrived with Andrew's medication, Miko allowed him to pass, his instincts trusting their routine. The war for Andrew's life had escalated beyond illness. It was now a battle against stealthy malice. And while no one could predict the final outcome, one thing was certain: Miko's intuition had to hold strong. If not, tragedy might strike, and this time, it could succeed. One drizzly afternoon, a shift occurred. Andrew slipped into a deeper, more perilous sleep. His breathing became shallow, his eyelids unmoving, his hands limp at his sides. Kayla and Devon, their faces tight with grief, took turns wiping his forehead with a cool cloth, watching helplessly as each breath grew lighter than the last. Miko, stretched across Andrew's feet, let out a heavy sigh, as though he, too, felt the weight of each fading moment. Nurses exchanged hushed whispers, their expressions somber. They had seen this before. This could be the final phase. One murmured, cautious in her wording but firm in her tone. The words landed like stones in Kayla's chest. Yet even as grief threatened to swallow them whole, the specter of sabotage still loomed. Talia had been quietly compiling everything she could, records of medication discrepancies, shifts that aligned with unexplained patient deaths. The technician's own words spoken in careless disdain. Dr. Patel, emboldened by his own guilt and the weight of responsibility, pressed the administration to escalate matters, to bring in law enforcement. But the higher-ups hesitated. A scandal like this could destroy trust in the hospital. They argued, each hour of inaction put patients at risk. And then, the confrontation happened. Kayla, already hanging by a thread, overheard the technician's voice again, this time. A flippant remark about letting nature take its course. Something inside her snapped. She stepped directly into his path, her voice trembling with rage. "My father is not your experiment," she hissed, her fists balled. "He deserves dignity. Your twisted beliefs don't give you the right to decide who lives and who dies." The technician barely flinched, his lips curled in an infuriating half-smile, his tone mocking. "If he's dying anyway," he said smoothly, "is it so wrong to speed up the inevitable?" Kayla felt fire in her veins, her entire body shaking with fury. Before she could lash out, Talia appeared, pulling her away with quiet urgency. "Not here," she whispered, "not like this." That night, Kayla recounted the exchange to Devon, her voice raw with frustration. "He doesn't even think he's doing anything wrong," she said, her throat tightening. "He actually believes he's helping." Devon's face darkened with something more than just anger, it was fear. "We have to protect Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Every second, together, they formed a plan, an unbreakable wall of vigilance. A small, trusted group of staff would take shifts keeping watch over Andrew. Dr. Patel's interns, sympathetic nurses from other wards, anyone who could be relied upon. And, of course, Miko. The cat never wavered, day or night, he remained the one constant. But another question haunted them. Should they urge the hospital to discharge Andrew? To transfer him to home hospice? Away from potential danger, yet the risk was immense. Moving him in his fragile state could hasten the inevitable. And beyond that, if the technician was never caught, how many others would suffer in silence? Andrew, in his few lucid moments, whispered, "Stop him, not just for me." They understood. This fight wasn't just about their father anymore. It was about ensuring no other patient had to face an unseen hand deciding their fate. While rummaging through old family photos one evening, Kayla stumbled upon a picture of Andrew as a young boy, grinning beside his childhood Labrador. Her heart clenched. "He's loved animals his whole life," she murmured, showing it to Devon. Devon swallowed hard, his voice thick. "And now Miko is the one teaching us about loyalty." Amid all these storms, both emotional and ethical, Talia wrestled with her own moral dilemma. She wanted to go to the police. She wanted to expose the truth. Blow the whistle before anyone else got hurt. But the hospital had already warned her. If she bypassed official channels, she could lose her job. "I don't know what to do," she admitted one night, her eyes damp with frustration. "If I stay silent, more lives are at risk. But if I speak out..." Kayla reached for her hand, squeezing it with quiet determination. "Trust your instincts," she said. "Andrew's life is worth the risk." And with that, an irreversible decision was set into motion. The battle was far from over.